happy to have Tom Chi talking with us today. He's a bit of a evangelist for this space, and he's a managing partner at One Ventures, and he was a founding member of the Google X team. He's an innovator, engineer, science guy par excellence, and he also cares a lot about the planet, and he's got some great innovation he's going to share. Tom, I'll hand it over to you, mate. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and go into presentation mode here. All right, so starting, oops, now is this click not working? All right, so starting at the kind of the very most zoomed out view, if we kind of take a look at how we got here, a lot's happened over, since the development of agriculture. So we have increased the human population on the planet since the development of agriculture by a factor of 1,000. And I think that a lot of times people hear that, or they just hear that, we're almost up at 8 billion people now. And they, people already start to get anxious, already start to be very worried just about these basic numbers, where a lot of thoughts come to mind, like, do we just have too many people on the planet? Are we going to be able to get to some sort of good relationship with the planet, given how many people are already here? And of course, the population will continue to grow by a couple more billion by the year 2050. But I'd like to kind of push back against that framing and share a potentially other way to go look at it. Now, what I'm going to share is not necessarily going to be easy to do, but I think it'll be clear that it'll be possible to do. So yes, there are almost 8 billion people on the planet right now. And if you were to take those 8 billion people and work out the biomass of all of that, so what's the mass of all of humanity together, it ends up being about 350 million tons. Now, coincidentally, or maybe not that coincidentally, if you were to take the biomass of all the ants on the planet, it actually ends up being roughly the same, around 350 million tons. And this is one of the ways that we're similar. There's lots of other ways that, we're similar to ants. They're also social organisms that create societies with different roles. A lot of them are omnivores. They're like us in a lot of different ways. And they also collectively have the same amount of biomass as all of humans. But one way that we are notably different is human beings eat a little bit less than 3% of their body weight per day, so about 2.8% on average globally. But ants eat about 30% of their body weight per day. And given that we have roughly the same biomass on the planet, for humans to go eat 3% of their body weight per day, it comes out to about 10 million tons of food per day, compared to ants eating 30% is more than 100 million tons of food per day. So basically, ants are eating the amount of food that a population of 80 billion humans would eat. Now, that said, we don't sit around talking about ant overpopulation and how the fact that they're eating so much of the planet, how that's destroying everything. And this is despite the fact that they literally eat 10 times more of the planet. They literally consume 10 times more of the planet than us every single day. We don't worry about them. Now, why do we not worry about ants? Well, the main thing is that as ants go about consuming 10 times more of the planet than us, they actually enrich the planet as they do so. They aerate the soils, they recycle nutrients, they provide a huge number of ecosystem services, which in totality ends up being more additive to the ecosystems that they're part of than anything that they are taking from the ecosystem by eating 100 million tons per day. And one could go summarize this, this thing that ants are doing as following a simple rule that not only, and it's a simple rule that not only ants follow, but really all species on the planet follows, except for us right now, which is, as you go about consuming, you want to go ask yourself the question, can we produce more ecosystem services than net ecosystem consumption? If you're able to do that, your existence in that ecosystem actually helps to make that ecosystem healthier over time, as opposed to degrading it. And it allows you to go live in ecosystems in harmony and actually be quite helpful to other organisms by your process of living and be able to stay there for a long, long time. Now, because we are in the opposite state right now, where as a civilization, we are consuming way more than the services that we provide, this is why we're kind of heading toward a cliff. But it's actually not about the absolute amount, because as mentioned, a second ago, like in terms of absolute amounts, ants eat actually substantially more than us. And of course, there's other organisms with even more biomass that consume way more of the planet than ants even. But, it's clear that it is possible for organisms to live and thrive and be quite productive on the planet and consume much more than us without creating any lasting damage. And in fact, actually be highly contributive to healthy functioning of the planet. Now, this begs the question then, could human beings ever do this, right? What would it look like if at the level of an entire civilization, we were following this rule? What if our entire civilization was providing more ecosystem services than consumption? So in other words, let's explore the question quickly of what would it look like for humanity to become a net positive to nature, where our presence on the planet, the more time that we're here, the healthier that nature is. Now, in order to go assess that, we first need to take a look at where we are right now. And right now, things are not that good. So these are a number of graphs that have to do with kind of the development of industry over the last 100 years or so. But I think it's all well summed up in this graphic. So over on the left-hand side, we start with the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution. So, roughly around the year 1750. And at that point, we had 280 parts per million in the atmosphere. Then through the course of the Industrial Revolution, we have burned a lot of coal, we burned a lot of oil, we burned a lot of natural gas. And you can see with each one of these, they've contributed a certain number of parts per million into the environment. And they represent a certain number of billions of tons of carbon dioxide that's been liberated that directly translates the parts per million. Now, we burned our fossil fuels. We obviously also produced cement, and notably, we changed the way that land was used. We drained wetlands. We cleared forest. We did a lot of things that also were largely emitting. And if that was all that happened, if all that happened was the stuff on the left-hand side of this graph, which is the human activities, then actually we would already be on an unlivable planet. We'd already be at about 570 to 580, parts per million in the atmosphere, which is not an environment that would be conducive for humans to continue existing on this planet. But luckily, it wasn't, just us doing this thing. The ecosystem has already been on our side trying to go close the gap. And since the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has absorbed, over 580 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Since the Industrial Revolution, the lands have absorbed over 650 billion, tons of carbon dioxide, and the rest has not been absorbed. The rest is still up in the atmosphere. And this is the 2018 concentration. At this point, we are closer to 420 parts per million. Things have not been getting better over the years, as one might expect. Now, so we got some good news and bad news, right? If it wasn't for the ecosystem, actually, we would have already killed ourselves. Like we've already be at an unlivable, kind of atmospheric concentration. So the good news is that the ecosystem has been helping us. The bad news is that in the process of helping us, the ecosystem has not been doing so well. So it's great that the oceans have been able to go absorb, almost 600 billion tons. But in that process, the entire ocean on the entire planet has gotten 30% more acidic. And if we were to continue that trend for another 80, 90 years, we're going to get to the point that basically shelled organisms are not going to be able to go form in the ocean anymore because of the acidity levels. Actually, the sequestration that went into the land mostly went into soils, trees, various ecosystems, and has not been particularly damaging. And then the stuff that's left over, more than 1 trillion tons, is still just hanging around in the atmosphere and creating the climate destabilization that we're all experiencing now. So that's one look at, how we're doing relative to our relationship to nature. So not looking so good. Another way that we are affecting nature is we're on a course right now to effectively eradicate coral reefs from the planet within the next 35 years. And this is because we've been warming up the oceans, and corals are the kind of organisms that can't regulate their body temperature separately from the temperature of the ocean around them. So as we heat up the oceans of the planet, then we also increase the temperature of internal temperature of these corals. And when it gets too hot, they bleach, and shortly after that, they die. And if we were to go lose all these coral reefs within the next 35 years, like effectively extincting shallow water coral from the planet within 35 years is roughly the trajectory we're on, then it means that 25% of all species in the entire ocean would instantly disappear with the disappearance of those reefs. And it's actually this work that had me kind of change the course of my career to really focus on investing in ways to be able to create a better sort of relationship to the environment by reinventing the way that we do all of industry. Now, beyond that, there's a lot more problems for the ocean. Oh, and also this is the work that brought me to be connected with you, because I got introduced to you all through Scott Countryman, who's doing a bunch of work on reefs as well in the Philippines. Okay, so there's a lot more challenges to oceans. I won't go through all of these. I think, you know, a lot of y'all may be well aware of these types of problems that are taxing our oceans. But suffice it to say that, you know, as we investigate that question of, you know, what would it take for humanity to become a net positive to nature? Well, right now, it's not looking that great. The damage is large, and the time that we have to go address this, you know, if, for example, we wanted to cut off the chain of losing all the coral reefs on the planet, is pretty short. So if the damage is large and the time is short, then how is it even plausible that we might become a net positive? And for that, I'd like to introduce a concept to you, which is the concept of an invention catalyst. And, you know, this starts to connect a bit with some of my historical work. So yes, I was one of the founding team members of Google X. I worked on the self-driving car, Google Glass, Project Loon. I worked on the contact lens that can continuously measure your glucose levels. I worked on lots of technology and helped to scale the team up from 6 people up to more than 300 people during the time that I was there to make all those projects happen. So without all that said, because I was fortunate enough to have that as part of my work history, you know, as part of my career so far, then I got introduced to this concept of the invention catalyst. So I think everybody knows what an invention is. An invention is you go and take something and you do it a bit differently. And because you've done it differently, it's got some slightly different, you know, attributes, and hopefully those attributes are improvements. So like if you got a toaster and you wanted to invent a slightly better toaster, then most inventions just improve a little bit on the thing that already exists, but doesn't necessarily change that much more. So let's say you invented a toaster that makes really nice toast and it works, you know, 5% faster. Well, these would all be, that's all quite nice, but probably your life doesn't change because, you know, your toaster goes 5% faster. And this is the case of most inventions. Most inventions are a mild improvement on the thing that exists and do not have, you know, particularly large ripple effects beyond that. But in contrast to that, there's a type of invention called an invention catalyst, which actually does have really substantial ripple effects. It is, of course, still a type of invention, but it's the kind of invention that breaks enough from how the previous one worked to be able to inspire potential system level change as opposed to just object level change. And an example of an invention catalyst, and I got to work on several in my career, because I also worked on web search, I worked on email, I worked on a lot of things that have changed a lot about society, actually. But, you know, a good example of invention catalyst, the self-driving car. And why would the self-driving car end up changing entire systems as opposed to just being like a cool car? Well, it turns out that, you know, the average utilization of cars that people own is about 4 to 5%. So 95% of the time that you own a car, you're not using it. So simple enough. And it means that we are kind of overproducing this object and effectively not using it most of the time after producing it. And this is obviously a huge resource use, both in terms of the materials that go into cars, but also in terms of of all the parking spots that we need for these cars that are not being used, et cetera, et cetera. But in a world where self-driving cars exist, then it's easy to imagine that we might be able to improve the utilization of each one of these cars. So instead of the car being used 4% of the time, one could imagine that a car ends up being used 40% of the time, in kind of a self-driving car share system. And if you do that, you still have 60% of the time for charging, maintenance, all the other stuff that you need. But you are getting 10 times more utility out of every single car. Now, if you can get 10 times more utility out of every car, you actually don't need quite as many cars. And you wouldn't necessarily have 10 times fewer cars. That's probably a little too extreme because, there'll be like rush hour. There'll be times where a larger chunk of people want to be driving at the same time. But you could easily reduce the number of cars by 70 to 80% and actually end up with more transportation utility. And if you're able to do that, it has huge catalytic effects because, 15 to 30% of all the space in cities are going to parking. Imagine you could reclaim 20, 30% of a city. Imagine, what New York City or Singapore or any of these places in the world would be like if they had 70% fewer cars on the road, just how much more livable they would be. And even back in 2010, when we were kicking off this project, we used to joke that once this became, widely adopted and the tech had gotten to the point that, safe enough to deploy everywhere, then we would go around to all the cities of the world to the signs that say parking lot and erase the trailing letter so it just left the word park. Because this type of invention would allow us to reimagine cities, reimagine so much about how we live our lives. So with that, you guys get the concept of what Invention Catalyst is. And we're now going to take that idea and we're going to start applying it to some areas that you guys are a little bit more interested in. And these are kind of a subset of some of the things that I'm seeing as an investor and managing partner of my own venture firm now, which is focused on investing in companies that help humanity become a net positive nature, really just in the spirit of what you are seeing right here. And we look for Invention Catalyst to go make that happen. So let's talk about ocean energy. So I know that you guys not too long ago got a presentation on wave energy. I think the Mackay folks spoke with y'all. And there's huge potential there because obviously there's a huge amount of energy in the waves. I think one thing that has been challenging for really anything related to ocean engineering is just that cost of construction and the logistical complexity of being able to go put things in here. So it would be catalytic to be able to dramatically change the cost of being able to system, which has got radically lower install cost. Effectively, they don't need to have they don't need to do a lot of ocean engineering in order to get this done. They need to be able to get down there, anchor a couple tensile lines, 4 tensile lines, and as soon as you get those lines anchored, you basically have a system that is moving in the waves and generating electricity for you. And they've already produced this system, and that's been continuously in the water for almost a year at this point. So they got lots of great data on it, and they're looking at building some of these systems to come. Now, this system is not quite there yet in terms of that levelized cost of generation, but you can see as they get to the X800 system, then yeah, like the payback period and the cost of generation starting to get pretty interesting. And it will already be interesting, earlier than that for island nations and other places where electricity is really expensive. So smaller island nations, not like, Indonesia, Philippines, not like a huge country, but yeah, smaller island nations or smaller islands in those nations could already start benefiting from something like this in the near term. And this is just some images to show you that these are not just pictures. This is a real system that is already deployed in the ocean. This is them basically monitoring like the stresses on the system during a large storm event that came through, showing that it actually survived the storm with no damages at all. And this system's already been deployed out there for a year, generating electricity. Some other stuff that might be interesting catalysts for energy in the ocean. So, of course, all of y'all have heard of offshore wind, but I think the interesting development that is happening in that sector, beyond, just more offshore, wind installations coming up, is once again a cost of deployment innovation. So floating wind, is starting to get off the ground right now. There's already a number of leases and projects that are underway, and you can kind of see the number of gigawatts and the types of companies that are working on floating wind. And there's that question though of like, how are you going to make this, highly economic in terms of the cost of deployment so that you can bring up this, 15 gigawatts comfortably. And beyond that, we see the potential for a really substantial trajectory here with the floating wind being able to go open up more sites that would be suitable to be able to go site electricity generation. So it's not just going to the places where you can do traditional offshore, but it's expanding out the pie in a substantial way. Now, if you could expand the pie in that substantial way, but install easily, then you kind of got something real compelling. Now, what's tough to go install here? Well, if you want to get, a really, like good economics on your wind turbine, then it's good to be able to put the biggest turbines up that you can. And practically around deployment in oceans, things like bridge clearance, things like, what it takes to actually stand up the turbine in the water, once you actually get all the materials together, these become the main issues. So really logistics issues and the OpEx around logistics. So when people are thinking about doing offshore wind, yes, it's, $100 million or more kind of situation to be able to even consider doing that type of work. And when you do a large farm, then yes, you're talking about a huge amount and a lot of logistic complexity in order to before you're generating any power at all. And what this company is doing is they have developed a platform for floating offshore wind, which means that you don't need to have all that kind of complex construction that kind of connects it to the ground. And this is actually an image of the first system that these founders worked on, and they worked on it at a company called Principal Power. And that already has some steel in the water. There's some floating wind that's already off the coast of Portugal that is generating right now. But some of the folks that worked on this actually, felt like they could do better, and they actually broke off to create a new company that has solved even more of the logistical problems. So they basically created a system that floats but can actually kind of collapse down and be flat so that you can pass it under, pass it under bridges, allow a number of different sorts of vehicles to be able to go tow it out and get it going. And these are effectively solving logistic problems, which maybe don't sound that sexy, but at the end of the day, very similar to the cow wave energy stuff that you saw just a second ago, very dramatically changes the cost to be able to bring up new generating capacity. And in the kind of classic, Clay Christensen sense of innovation and disruption, kind of his rule of thumb is, hey, if you're going to go and disrupt, actually be worse than the existing thing, but be crazy cheap compared to the existing thing. Like that's a good place to start. And both of these things that I've just been talking about have dramatically cheaper installation costs. And yes, there are some kinks to work out, but if you get that done, then I think it starts to have a catalytic effect, whether it's by massively expanding the areas that you can generate in, or massively reducing the financing that's required to get some of these things off the ground, or even being able to do things like setting something up. And and of course you do your ecological surveys before you get your permits to do anything. But like, let's say you do all that, but then you find out that later on that you're actually creating damage. Something like this could easily be resited in another place.
The impact on tourist arrivals in 2020.
I'm not sure what that is, but okay.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, Tom, I just muted somebody.
Okay, yeah. So let's move on to another topic. We're going to move on to ecosystem restoration in the oceans. And for that, we're going to circle back for a second to a different invention catalyst that my firm has invested in. So the ocean things that you just saw, we evaluated. We didn't invest in them yet. We can talk about that if that's interesting. But we did invest in this company. And what this company does is it looks at trying to be able to do terrestrial ecosystem restoration at scale. So they've already created these drones that are able to plant 120 trees per minute. And if you are able to go plant 120 trees per minute, you can go ask yourself the question, what would it take to go and plant billions of trees in a year? Now, why would that be interesting? Well, when a tree grows up, when a tree gets to maturity, it weighs between 2 to 20 tons. And of course, this is like the average tree. The biggest trees, like the giant redwoods, which are not that far from where I am right now, those are more like 1,000 tons. So trees can get a lot more heavy, a lot heavier than 2 to 20 tons, but your average tree weighs between 2 to 20 tons. And trees broadly are roughly 50% carbon by mass, and that carbon has all been captured from the air. In fact, most of the mass of a tree and most of the mass of all plants, actually, like more than 95% of the mass of any plant, actually comes from the air. It doesn't come from the soil. The soil is really just providing a couple special nutrients. It's actually not contributing a large mass percentage to plants. So what it means is if you see a tree that weighs 2 to 20 tons, you're actually seeing 1 to 10 tons of carbon that's been crystallized out of the air. And if you're able to go plant hundreds of billions or even a trillion such trees, then you can actually go after a gap that is this big. If you guys remember up here, 1 trillion tons of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you could go and look at addressing that with trees. So once again, a catalytic thought that one could have with it. Now, what would that look like in practice? Well, if we wanted to plant 20 billion trees per year over the course of 50 years, which is one way to get to 1 trillion, that only requires 9,000 drones and 450 staff in order to go do it, and only about $80 million a year in OPEX. So actually dramatically cheaper than the ways that we're talking about dealing with climate change right now. Now, actually, to show you some of this stuff in action, because this all seems quite conceptual until you just see what it looks like. Well, actually, let me show you this first. So this is what the drones were able to go do on a mining site that where there had been, everything had been strip mined, and then the overburden was replaced after. The overburden is like what used to be the ecosystem, but is just now dirt after the strip mining. That's been put back on top after the ore has been removed. And then they used to be called biocarbon engineering. Now they're called Dendra. The ecosystem restoration drone team went out there, and at the beginning of 2019, after checking it out, the drones did their thing for just about 3 weeks. So actually not even very long. And then 18 months after that point, this is the same landscape. And you can polyculture. This is not a monoculture, put exactly the same seeds everywhere. They actually put in a diverse ecosystem at the proportion of which species are meant to be in what proportions and in what places in the ecosystem. So you're getting a very robust ecosystem restoration from something like this. But let's move this a little bit closer to the ocean, since this is what we're meaning to focus on in this presentation. So you guys can't hear the audio, so I'm just going to voice it over. But you can see this drone flying over, and it is planting mangroves over here. And I'm just going to voice over so you can approximate, you can approximately hear what's going on. But as this is flying, it sounds like tick, 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 tick. So every one of those ticks, and you guys can't hear it, but every one of those ticks is this drone planting a mangrove. And if you were to fast forward a couple months after that planting, this is what the landscape looks like. And if you fast forward 14 months, this is what it looks like. And this is just to say that this is not some hypothetical idea that will get done someday. This is a company that is already able to restore a very wide variety of ecosystems from like Australian drylands to like, this is obviously a coastal wetland. They've done rainforests, they've done boreal forest, they've done highland forest, they've done many different types of ecosystem with their platform, and they've been exponentially reducing the cost of restoration. And right now they are the cheapest way to restore a hectare of anything. And definitely in mangroves, they are head and shoulders above in terms of the cost of restoration. Now, okay, with that in mind, that's a pretty cool thing that we're already able to do with terrestrial ecosystems, and now starting to overlap with marine ecosystems in the form of mangroves and other nearshore environments. But let's kind of pop back to that question of coral. Now, inspired by a bunch of this work that I experienced by investing in the ecosystem restoration drones, I actually put together a small team to go and chase down the question of whether we could build something similar for coral restoration. And what you're going to go see here is, I'm going to turn this down so I can voice it over because you guys can't hear any of this anyway. So what you're going to see here is basically a robot in the same spirit as the ecosystem restoration drones, but focused on coral reef restoration. And in this video, we go through 3 different trials. They're near the shore. You can see what's happening here. Like, corals need to be planted into hard surfaces. So we do a small drill hole. It's about a 1.5 centimeters deep and maybe 8 millimeters wide. And then that gives us the spot where we can go plant a nursery coral into a spot on the reef. And here we are, in open water, testing in more challenging environments. In this case, there was too much rubble on the ground to be able to get it done. And we'll fast forward. So you'll see we're out here in once again in open water environments, and this is us successfully getting the basic platform going. But you can actually see at this point we're just planting the nursery plugs, but we're not planting the corals yet. But actually, as of 3 weeks ago, when I was in Hawaii last, we actually got the first live coral planted back in a reef using our platform. Oh yeah, so there you see the plug went in there. And I'll show you what that looks like right now. Yeah, there we go. So this is the first live coral that was put back in the reef by the robot. And actually, after we did this one, we did several others because the robot is able to kind of carry down a magazine of nursery corals to be able to go plant. Now, why might this be interesting? Why might this be catalytic? Well, right now we do have a number of coral nurseries out there that are trying to go and stem the losses of the reef, or maybe even more ambitiously try to actively restore the reefs that they're next to. But one substantial bottleneck to that effort is the process of planting that coral back in the environment. So it's called the outplanting task. Because what that requires right now is a human being with a drill and 2-part marine epoxy and about 5 to 10 minutes per coral fragment that gets planted. This robot, actually, as you saw in the video, is able to go do the thing that humans take 5 to 10 minutes to do. It's able to do it right now in about 15 seconds. And we believe to go and reduce the time to plant that much, and you're able to use the robot to bring down large magazines of coral so it doesn't need to keep on coming back up and down to be able to get a decent amount of planting done. And you're able to keep the robot cheap enough that you can make little swarms of this. Then you can increase our rate of planting of corals by 3-4 orders of magnitude quite easily. And from the cost perspective, I hadn't mentioned this before, but because we know that a lot of communities next to coral reefs are not necessarily the wealthiest communities, they don't necessarily have all the financial resources to be able to afford an expensive robot. We've targeted the entire, like the cost of everything in the robot to be less than $5,000, and so far we have kept to that. So that's kind of at the zone that an island community could pool some money together and purchase one to restore their reefs, or a wealthy donor could go and buy thousands of them for, tens of millions of dollars and really have a substantial impact on our ability to be able to restore reefs at scale. And there are other innovations, other potential catalysts. So this is some work actually that piloted off of the coast of Indonesia about 2 years ago, and these are marine permaculture arrays. And effectively, there's two different approaches to this, but the one that's a little bit more compelling, and you actually see the little line coming up here, is using artificial upwelling, because effectively things grow in the ocean the fastest when you're able to go combine the nutrient-rich waters that are colder and deeper down with all the energy from the sun near the surface. And typically those stay separate because warm water wants to rise, cold water wants to sink. All the nutrients are down there in the cold water. All the energy is up here with the sunlight. And whenever you're able to get, those nutrients back to the top, you tend to have an explosion of productivity, biological productivity. So this is a system that basically automates the upwelling process of bringing those nutrients up, and then accelerates the growth of seaweed forests in kind of a controlled way. Now, if you're able to go do this, kelp and other seaweeds grow very, very fast. During the middle of a kelp's growth cycle, it can grow 1 meter in a day, and it takes about 11 months to get to full maturity. And because of it, they are also really good carbon sponges for the environment. So, every one of these, every square kilometer of this tech could pull out 3,500 tons per year, which means, and this is a bit aggressive, but this is the calculation. But if you could cover 2% of the ocean with this this kind of approach, then you'd be able to fully pay off the trillion tons of carbon dioxide that we have up in the atmosphere within about 50 years as well. So with that, I think the last thing I'll share as a kind of catalytic thing is our own consciousness. And that sounds really obscure, but like what you're seeing in this picture here is the first time I gave the progenitor talk to this talk, I actually gave it in Quito, Ecuador in 2018. And it happened to be a conference that was meant to go inspire all these Latin American entrepreneurs. That was the conference I was speaking at. But it happened on exactly the same week as another conference, which was about the rights of nature. And what had happened was, 10 years prior to 2018, Ecuador had kind of redone its constitution, rebooted its currency to be the US dollar instead of a peso. And in the redrafting of their constitution, they added a couple sentences, and you guys can look it up online. It's less than 500 words for sure. But in those 500 words, they basically ascribed rights to nature in Ecuador. It means that a river has a right to flow, a forest has the right to go and restore itself. And over the course of the 10 years between 2008 and 2018, actually those rights were challenged in courts of law. So that actually, and nature won a number of times, not every time, but nature won a number of times. So it actually meant that case law was starting to get established that really started to create the contours of what it means for nature to have rights in a society. Now, at the end of the day, what happened? It's not like they built some breakthrough piece of hardware or they worked out some fantastic way to reduce construction logistics costs by a factor of 20, or a way to speed up coral planting by a factor of 100, or reduce the cost of restoring an ecosystem by a factor of 5. Like, they hadn't done anything like that. They just authored a couple words that basically spoke to a different consciousness in terms of how we relate to our to the natural world, and that by itself led to many interesting, like a whole domino effect of interesting changes from just a handful of words. Oh, actually, I don't know if we have time. Well, I'll say it very quickly. Let's see. So an example of consciousness changing and that getting to very different outcomes. So this is actually work I worked on as well, but I was supporting this team that was bringing electricity to the northern part of Guatemala. And Guatemala has got 26 languages. Only one of them is Spanish. The other 25 are ancient indigenous languages. And the people that speak them, a lot of them do not speak Spanish. And because of that, according to the UN, they are some of the lowest human development index populations on the planet because they can't access any government services because they can't speak Spanish in Guatemala. And because of it, it's a large population. Many of them have never had electricity in their lives, and most of them live on less than $1 a day. Some of them live on $2 a day, but that's the kind of range we're talking about here. And what this company did is it basically created a solar electric box that allowed these folks to get access to electricity for the first time in their lives and does all these really great things. I don't want to get into all of it. But initially, we went out there with kind of the standard business model for hardware where you go in there and you make all of your money in that first sale. So you get all of your margin right up front when you first sell the good. That's how most hardware is sold. And when you have that way of doing business, you have an incentive to do what's called reducing the BOM, reducing the build of materials, where you go in there and you look at everything that you use to go make your product, and you ask yourself, okay, for part number 5, is there a cheaper part that we could use that would still do the job? Because if you can reduce that BOM, if you can bring it down another $5, well, that's $5 more of profit that goes right to you. And because of it, like everybody in modern consumer electronics is out there reducing the BOM. And because of it, we are living in an era where our electronics are less reliable than ever, right? Like if you have a cell phone that's 5 years old, it's probably a piece of garbage now. And it's because the engineers on the other side of the equation spent all this time swapping out every part with a slightly cheaper part in order to get a little bit more margin out of the thing. And they're like, well, hey, you might throw away your phone anyway in 5 years, so who cares? And this is how we've arrived at a very wasteful kind of relationship to that industry. Now, in this particular case, we changed our consciousness a little bit. And in this case, we changed our consciousness because the people we were selling to couldn't afford the price of the box all up front. So we modified the price of the box so that instead of paying up front, like a classic hardware sale, you pay as you go. So as you use electricity, you pay a little bit for that electricity, but we priced the electricity to be cheaper than the cost of candles. So we priced a week of electricity to be substantially cheaper than what they were already paying for a week of candles, which is how they are currently lighting their homes. And because of it, the thing took off like crazy, huge adoption. But beyond that, because we stopped making all of our money up front as a single, moment where you're trying to maximize that margin from reducing the BOM, I calculated since, people are paying as they go, actually the longer that the device, lasts, the more money that we make out of each device. Actually, the device is way more profitable if it ends up being really robust and sturdy. And instead of going through the BOM and asking ourselves the question, okay, this part costs this much, can we find a part that costs 20% less or a part that costs 30% less, and basically making everything in it cheap and low quality, we actually flipped this around and we stack ranked it by, okay, here's all the parts in the box, which ones have got the shortest mean time to failure, and which ones are next shortest, which ones are the next shortest. And we actually went there and we asked ourselves the simple question, which is, well, if we could spend $5 more and it would increase the life of the product by more than 3 months, it was worth it. So on every one of those parts, we asked that, and we actually upgraded a number of parts, increased the cost of the product by a little bit less than $20, but we moved the mean time to failure out to almost 40 years. And I don't know that there's any other consumer electronics you can buy in the world right now that you can count on for 40 years. And these have been out in the field in the humidity of Guatemala for over a decade, and we've had almost no failures. So I think we did succeed at that. But that's a concrete example of what happens when you shift your consciousness a little bit. And, a lot of the cascading effects that the shift in consciousness itself can also be highly catalytic, just like Invention Catalyst can be. All right, that's it.
Thanks, Tom. We went a bit long, but that's good. I wasn't going to stop you because your last point, I think, is really important when you talk about changing consciousness, because our landfills are full of junk that breaks in 12 months. So, and also we're full of materials in our wastewater treatment plants that come off processes where they have to be repaired. So I think that's a very interesting point. Jin Ming has raised a question, and I think it would be worth reinforcing it. It is in the chat. Thanks for a good presentation. If tropical coral reefs die in the existing ocean conditions, how can we ensure that new coral reefs we plant will survive? I think that goes to heat resistance and acidity resistance, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so we are working. So those first live corals that you saw planted were actually planted quite close to the spot in Hawaii where they are working on selective breeding to improve the heat resistance of corals. So that's one answer to the question. But the other answer to the question is, historically, corals actually have survived, dramatic temperature swings on the planet, but they've survived it because those temperature swings took place over the course of thousands of years. And if a coral's got thousands of years, it goes and deals with this stuff by migrating, further from the equator or closer to the equator as a function of how hot the planet is. Well, because of how quickly we're changing the temperature of the planet right now, they're not going to be able to move fast enough. But we can go help with this, because if we can actively robotically plant, we can re-site some of this coral a little bit further from the equator, basically, in waters that are going to be cooler for more decades in the future.
Yeah, we had a presentation from the Global Ocean Acidification and Observation Network, and they mentioned that the rate at which we're acidifying the planet is 10 times faster than any time in the last 300,000 years, including during the extinction 65 million years ago, which Stanford recently said was probably not due to an asteroid impact, but probably due to an anoxic event reducing the amount of oxygen available for large organisms. So that was pretty terrifying. That was pretty terrifying. So, and I think it also, your comment goes that that comment goes hand in hand with that we don't necessarily need to replant corals, but we also need to look at mechanisms to get the carbon out of the biosphere and sequester it. So,
yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, corals do a little bit of their own part. They're not going to be able to move that much tonnage, but as they make their skeletons, they are taking carbon out of the water as well.
Okay. Scott, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it wasn't really much a question as such as a comment about how the dendra, we have places, let's say in the Marshall Islands, where pirate fishermen have cut down all the trees on the island, and there's a real need to replant native vegetation on these places to reduce shoreline erosion. So I think dendra would be a great solution for some of those locations.
So they're doing something exactly like that on Lord Howe Island right now, basically returning a lot of the natural species and monitoring and wiping out the invasives.
Okay.
The other comment, Tom, is there are a couple other of your companies I think are really relevant to the uses of renewable energy on these remote islands, and what comes to mind is the iron ox, for food production.
Yeah.
And the Mighty Air, I think it's called, the EVOTL technology.
Oh, Mighty Fly, yeah, absolutely.
And maybe there's some comments that you can make on how renewable energy may be able to help some island communities.
Oh yeah, we have that, and we also have the vertical axis generation turbines. I mean, like I definitely want to cover people's questions, but if we run out of questions, I can show you guys a lot on that in a short amount of time as well.
Cool. Thanks.
Well, let Dan Milson ask a question, and then maybe you want to do just present a little bit, and Nick Lambert's going to ask some questions as well. Dan, you're first, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's a really great presentation, and I like the idea of the coral bots, but I also like the idea of the seagrasses and growing coral and seagrass and shellfish together, where we can get, really counteract the ocean acidification. My question was that kelp project that you showed, that number 3,500 tons CO2 per square kilometer per year, was that independently verified? Is there some literature on that you could share with us? Because I haven't seen any numbers that high for doing, marine biomass.
So there is a pilot that happened off the coast of, well, it's actually still happening off the coast of Indonesia, and it didn't fully achieve those numbers yet, but it's moving in that direction. I can connect you with the researchers if it's interesting. Actually, it's good that you mentioned seagrass as well, because once we kicked off the coral planting robot project, we got noticed by Grantham Foundation, which is a big environmental investor, and they basically said, well, could you use the same robot to plant seagrasses? And actually, we're going to go pilot seagrass planting using the same robot platform, but a totally different planting end effector. We're going to go pilot that in the field in 5 weeks. So that's about to happen too. But yeah, our control tests in the lab, yeah, we already have a way of planting some seagrasses.
Cool. Nick.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. I love the, and don't take this comment the wrong way, but I love the high level simplicity and clarity of your construct and context. I thought that was excellent. And there are a lot of people out there, decision makers, people with authority to invest, who will understand that context very quickly. And you know, I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but I think that was really clear and really helpful. I have one question which I think is a little bit wet, but I am curious, and then another one which is separate, and I'm going to ask both at the same time. The first one is, if you're going to plant billions of seeds, do we have a seed bank of billions of seeds which are sufficiently robust enough that, however they are planted by those drones, that there is a high probability that they will grow? So if where you're scaling that, you have to have the resource to scale. Clearly, we can make 9,000 drones, but how do we have a surety around the robustness of the seeds and that they will take? And then the second question I wanted to ask, and you might want to just include it as part of the follow-on comments you're going to make, is how do you find your companies? Because you have this approach of we need to do our social and economic extractive activities in a way that restores ecosystems faster than we damage them. So how do you go about finding companies that are coming up with solutions that are scalable, that fulfill that high level contextual perspective? Sorry for the wet question on the seas, but I am curious.
Oh no, this is no problem. No problem at all. You know, relative to how we find companies, we looked at 3,200 deals before to do our first 25 placements. So if you source widely enough, you can keep your standards really high. And in our particular case, like every one of the companies we've invested in has got disruptive deep tech, which is driving radically better unit economics. So this is not like you need to pay this green premium. You know, if you vote with your conscience, you would pay 2 times more for this stuff. The stuff we invest in costs radically less to get the same quality of result or a better result. And, you know, it's that those better unit economics are paired with radically better environmental economics as well. And if you can get that combo, disruptive deep tech that's driving radically better unit economics and radically better environmental economics, then you get kind of the best of all worlds, because you don't have that tension between like, oh, do we push on this and have, you know, the do we support the environment or do we support the business? Actually, the business succeeding is the environment succeeding in that particular case, right? If you get all those attributes. Now, you can't get those attributes, though, unless you source really widely. And that is effectively what we've done and continue to do. And in terms of the performance, we have totally gotten there as well. So in our first 2 years, we've been averaging 64% net IRR. So actually outperforming 95% of all venture firms in the Valley, even though we do deep tech hardware for the environment, stuff that a lot of people told me was impossible, but that now just happened. So pretty sure it's possible. Going back to your previous question on the seeds, yes. So having a supply chain of seeds to be able to go plant, quite important. Nice thing about most plants is that they do overproduce their seeds quite a bit. You are correct, though, in terms of not every seed is as good as every other seed. So to the extent that you can collect the species and the local varietals that are appropriate for that microclimate, then you improve your likelihood of germination and survival. But I will say that the robots as is, when they plant a seed, it actually has the same germination rate as nature planting that same seed in the environment. So we're not doing any worse for the seed right now. But you can't just peg the germination rate at a specific number, because in a tropical rainforest, typical germination rate might be 85%, but in a boreal forest, the germination rate might be 15%. And that's like what nature does as well, right? Just it's a harsher condition, way fewer things take. And that's true whether nature's planting it or we're planting it. But what's nice about that approach is because we so radically reduce the price to go plant, then if you know that you're only going to have a 30% take rate or 50% take rate, you can just plant twice as many. Like the cost of planting it gets so reductively small that it's actually relatively easy to get to your target by just scaling up how much kind of raw material, how much seed you're planting in the first place.
Thanks, Tom. One of the things I'd be interested to find out is the germination and survival rate for mangroves, because I'm currently in southern Malaysia, and they're very keen to plant mangroves. They're also very keen to look at marine permaculture, because they've got problems with nutrient not upflow, but nutrient from runoff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a different set of problems, but their success rate on mangroves is very low. It's about 10 to 15%.
Yeah, ours is actually quite good, which is why you can see that when the things were growing, they almost looked like a perfect row, because we probably should have adjusted the flight path to like make it look a little bit more naturalistic. Though this is more of an aesthetic question, because mangroves, when they become, dense, basically cover the entire area. So actually, if you go and plant in like a hexagonal or even a rectilinear grid that fills the whole area, then honestly comes out pretty similar, though a little bit more variety might have been aesthetically nicer. But the fact that you saw all of those mangroves coming up in a row means that our survival rate's incredibly high. It's most of them are surviving. Wow,
that's fantastic. Okay, has anyone else got any questions? I'm surprised we're a little bit short on. I'm not getting as many questions as I would have thought. In the interim, I wanted to mention that we've just released a Blue Bond Incubator. So I'd be interested to introduce you to those folks, Tom, because there may be some cross-pollination for some of your ventures. We'd be very keen to keep talking to you and keep engaging with you, and even see if there's an opportunity somewhere we can roll out a pilot, or maybe one of your projects maybe want to put its hand up to be reviewed by our expert team on the MARS TA. I'll tell you a little bit about that later on.
I think the thing that might be a good way to cap everything off is I can play this video. I'll just voice it over because you guys won't be able to hear the music or anything, but I'll also send the link that you can share it with people more broadly. But this will give you like 20 invention catalysts in a row and show you that something like this is not just a curiosity. There's enough of this out there that we can make a very big difference by taking this approach to investing. And I do need to mention that I am raising our second fund right now, because the first fund is going quite well, but we got to go and move on to deploying out of fund 2. So if you do know folks I should be talking to on that front, then let me know. But in the interim, I'll just play this and voice over what's happening.
Thanks, Tom.
Oh, sorry. Let me scoot back, because you guys got to read the captions to be able to see what's happening. So you can see that's a robot that's building that building. It's a 10 times faster, 3 times cheaper. Actually, I'll scoot back. This tractor is driving itself. There's no driver in there, so it's able to go and obviously reduce the unit economics of tending fields. This is textile dyeing with no wastewater. This is cellular agriculture for Wagyu beef. This is a grid storage system that scales super linearly and is massively cheaper than lithium ion. This is a completely earth digestible styrofoam, so it marine degrades and soil degrades in less than a month, but costs 30% cheaper than traditional styrofoam to produce.
Wow.
This is cellular agriculture bluefin tuna, so we don't need to kill all the tuna in the ocean anymore. This is sorry, you missed one that's real important. This is the best OpEx, battery recycling company in the world. So dramatically better OpEx than Redwood Materials, Li-Cycle, and about half as expensive to be able to get a higher quality battery recycling outcome. This is the best terrestrial biomass assessment on the planet. Oh, this is Dendrosystems. You can see them. This is on Lord Howe Island right now, them evaluating things. This is pet food that didn't require any animals to die to go do it. The protein comes from yeast and fungi. That one actually is important. This is an air conditioner that has 6,000 times less greenhouse gas impact from its refrigerants and also has got 2x better OPEX. And this is basically, you guys are hearing the same solution form over and over. Radically better unit economics, radically better environmental economics. This is a halfway point. You're about to see a bunch more things. So this is a reverse logistics and forward logistics, a hybrid VTOL that's able to, man, I can't say it fast enough. This is a cement that has radically lower carbon footprint. That is a technology that can massively speed up the discovery of the genes that help crops to become climate resistant. So we're going to need a bunch of that. This is the development of technologies that allow us to preserve species that are on the brink or even bring species back. This is a technology that dramatically reduces, it can reduce field inputs by 95% via precision application. This is well, man, that one's really important, but it went by too fast. This vertical axis wind turbines with economics very similar to solar panels. And then these are robots that are able to go grow organic produce about 2 to 3 times cheaper than outdoor agriculture, cost structure of outdoor agriculture. So yeah, there you go. That's a bunch of Fund 1, but we're about to get into Fund 2 now.
Okay, Tom, thanks for that. We'll have to stop the recording now, but I think there are a few other questions that might come after the recording. So I'll thank you very much, and I'll stop the recording, and then